Hello, historians. Welcome to On This Day in History, because yesterday makes today and changes what happens tomorrow. So let's take a short look at what happened today, the 12th of June. In 1381, we saw an important event in the Peasants Revolt, where rebels arrived at Blackheath, just outside of London, and began to organize their movement. In 1830, the start of the French colonization of Algeria. 34,000 French soldiers landed at Algiers in order to take control of the nation. Now, keep in mind, in 1830, an army of 34,000 is gargantuan. In 2020, an army of 34,000 is very, very big. So keep in mind, this is big by today's standards. It is gargantuan by 1830 standards. And it also hopefully reminds us that European colonizers weren't necessarily peaceful with their intentions or with their methods. So in 1931, Al Capone, this is him at the gentleman at the top, also known as Scarface, if you can see the scar coming down from his left cheek there, was indicted, which means he's charged essentially on 5,000 counts of prohibition and on perjury. If you've never heard of Al Capone, he is perhaps the most famous gangster of all time, operating out of Chicago, and he was somewhat notorious for his methods, techniques, and approach to quote unquote business. On his business card, it actually said he was in the antiques business, when in actual fact, he made his money through gambling and, of course, illegal distribution of alcohol. He would eventually be taken down not on his prohibition charges, not on his perjury charges, but on tax evasion. There you go. In 1942, on this day, Anne Frank was given a gift, a diary in Amsterdam. So that particular, somewhat innocuous seeming event, girl gets diary for her birthday, doesn't seem like it should be one of those things that would change history, but as I hope we all know, it does. And this is my attempt to encourage you. If you are not keeping a diary or journal of some kind, I would begin to do so. You never know how useful it is going to be. One thing that comes up sometimes in class, people ask, what's history going to be like 100 years from now? What's history going to be like 200 years from now if no one's writing anything down? Because it's all emails, it's all tweets. Well, I hope that the screen captures that people take of those tweets and the so-called Wayback Machine, which downloads and saves web pages that are considered to be of historical significance. I hope that they are still functioning. If not, well, written documents are getting rarer and rarer these days, so that could make history quite interesting in the future. But Anne Frank, on this day, her journal would go on to become a bestseller and reveal a perspective of that period of history, of the Holocaust, of Nazi occupation, of the Netherlands, in a way that you cannot get from just looking at SS reports or looking at Allied intelligence reports. This was a very human observation of that particular time. So it's an invaluable resource that just makes the intelligence of Anne Frank, the potential of Anne Frank, really shine through and makes her death all the more tragic. On this day in 1964, Nelson Mandela was sentenced to life in prison in South Africa for his activism. They charged him essentially as a terrorist. They believed he was far too violent in his actions. He was meant to be locked away, never to be seen again, only to later become a symbol for the movement of fighting against apartheid, the separation of blacks and whites in South Africa. And he would, of course, go on to become president of the new South Africa in the 90s. So quite the turnaround. And on this day in 1981, the Raiders of the Lost Ark, the very first Indiana Jones film, had its premiere. Now, this is one of those things which is quite an interesting, I would say, turning point in cinema, because the creators of this particular story, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas, sort of wanted to make it a bit of a throwback. It was meant to be a look at the old serials, kind of like the old radio shows, hence its setting in the 1930s of just adventure, excitement, all of those things. It was meant to be a throwback, a look back, if you will. But in actual fact, it brought in a new kind of filmmaking in the sense that there was a lot of stunt work done, the special effects that were used, and storytelling and fantasy, all of those ideas. And we would see Indiana Jones be copied or influenced in many other particular stories. For example, the Brendan Fraser movies of The Mummy, or for example, the Lara Croft Tomb Raider video game and subsequent movies as well, all influenced by Indiana Jones. Now, as far as I'm concerned, Indiana Jones is only a trilogy. The fourth one, of course, never happened. It did, but let's pretend it didn't. Okay, now for the deep dive of the day, we are going to look more closely at this Peasants Revolt, because I believe it is somewhat relevant into that, well, very relevant all the time, but especially in 2020. Now, before we get into what the Peasants Revolt was, what it was all about, what happened, think about this. There is there are many monuments, but there is a particular monument or commemorative plaque, shall we say, the Islington People's Plaque, commemorating the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. And it commemorates the destruction of a building. Highbury Manor was burnt and destroyed. It seems odd that you would remember such an event or commemorate such an event like that, but that is exactly what they did. Now, if we actually look, the Peasants' Revolt actually takes place between the 30th of May and the 15th of June in 1381. So it was not a single day event. It built up over time and escalated and got bigger and bigger and bigger. And a particular key event took place on this day, the 12th of June in 1381. But it began in Kent and Essex, so outside of London. But it snowballed from there. It got bigger and bigger and bigger as rebel groups marched on London, and they attacked towns and villages as they went. So this revolt was indeed quite violent. There was a lot of destruction of property. Many people died. The riots begin in Kent and Essex on the 30th of May, but it so what started as a spontaneous uprising, if you will, with violence and, just, as I say, destruction of property, that which has happened many times before, where villages have decided to rebel against the people holding them and in charge of them. Well, it had happened before, but this indeed changed into something else. And it was all because of this particular event. By the 7th of June, a man by the name of Wat Tyler was appointed the leader of these rebels. And he was a former soldier. He was a peasant himself, but he was quite respected, and he was also quite intelligent, and he preached calm. He was able to get all these groups together and unite for one purpose. So they marched on the road towards London, and they went through Rochester and Canterbury. And as they went through, they were recruiting more and more and more people to their cause. And it was on this day, the 12th of June, that they got to London. Now, why were they going to London? London is the seat of power at this time. So they were going directly to those in charge, not the local people in charge, but the ones in charge of the entire nation. This would be the equivalent of a march on Washington in the United States, or I would say a march on Canberra in Australia, but you'd probably get a better result marching on Sydney or Melbourne. But a march to the leaders, taking it straight to the top. So what was it all about? Well, like many things in history, this was influenced by money, and in particular, the need for money, and in particular, the need to take money from peasants in the form of taxes. So what was actually going on in 1381 sort of has its origins, well, as far back as 1351, but I won't necessarily do an entire lesson on it. Let's keep it localized. So the year before, shall we say, uh, the Parliament in Northampton in 1380 sort of passed a law. Now, there had already been tension with the people of London, with the peasants of London. There had been instances of rebellion, instances of people defying the orders of their lords or of the soldiers that they uh, were in fear of, shall we say. And it was a tense situation. That is actually why Parliament at the time was in Northampton and not Westminster, because the lords at the time did not believe they would be safe if they went all the way into central London, into Westminster. They thought they might be trapped. So they are having Parliament at Northampton. So there's already a bit of a tense situation where the people don't really want to listen to their leaders. They're a little bit frustrated. And one of the reasons for this, there were many, but one of the main reasons for this inciting incident, if you will, was that the crown, meaning the king, the nation, if you will, was in a precarious financial state, which is a fancy way of saying they had no money. The French and Spanish were thought to be planning to invade. There were instances of military ships from Spain and military ships from France being spotted in the English Channel looking aggressive. So funds were urgently needed to defend the country. So let's have another tax. This is where taxes come to shape, and not wanting to pay them, come to shape the world in so many ways. This would be seen again in, for example, the American Revolution as well, one of the more famous incidents. The tax was raised to 3 times its normal amount. So the peasants who are already stretched thin, as in they already have very little money, that's why they are peasants, they are not wealthy lords, they are expected to pay 3 times more for this tax. That doesn't seem like a recipe for success. So what ends up happening? In Brentwood in Essex, a tax collector by the name of John Bampton was met with defiance, and eventually he tried to track down and be tough. You will pay now or you will face the consequences. And they said, what are you going to do? And he tried to get his soldiers that were with him to force them to hand over their taxes, but was met with equal measure of defiance and strength and violence. And eventually the people turned on him as well, and he was forced to flee for his life. He did not simply go back to his local lord in Essex. He went all the way back to London, fearing that only in London would there be enough central power from the king to keep him safe. So this escalated beyond this one town where you can imagine the tax collectors were sent packing from this town. All the other towns heard about it and they started sending their own tax collectors, their own bailiffs were sent away and had to flee because of fear for their own lives. So they came to collect the taxes. The people said no. They said, oh yeah, we'll see about that. And the people said, yeah, we will. And it escalated from there. So the organized mass in all of these particular towns on the outskirts of London or around in and around what would be Greater London, these people needed a leader, and they came together and elected Wat Tyler. He was a very effective leader, and he managed to keep the peasants in the Peasants Revolt, the mob, if you will, under somewhat control. He would instigate rules saying anyone doing anything against the cause, anyone who was out for their own interests would be punished. So, for example, when they were marching towards London and attacking symbols of the power of the lords, of the crown, of the king, some people were looting those particular buildings and trying to take the gold for themselves. Not only did Wat Tyler ban this practice, he executed those who he found were doing it. So in this way, he was trying to keep the message simple. We want to be treated fairly. We're not going to pay this tax. It is unfair. Now, the peasants' numbers reached about 60,000. Now, this is at a time when the population as a whole is about 3 million. So, if we extrapolate, if you will, the population of the UK is 65-ish million now. So what's that? 22 times higher. So 22 times 60,000 is about 12 million-ish. That's what that would be like if 12 million people were marching. That is mammoth. That is gigantic. Check my maths, by the way. I may be wrong. So they armed themselves with axes and scythes, which is, you may have seen as farm equipment, if you will. Some were lucky enough to have swords, bows, and arrows, but generally speaking, they were armed with farm equipment or limited weapons, sticks. They were not a formal army at all. So they begin to march to London to demand an audience with the king. Now, it was on this day, the 12th of June, that they got to Blackheath. This is when they came together, sort of, again, reaffirm what they were asking for to make sure their demands would be met. So, King Richard II, who had come to power at age 10, was just 14 years old at this stage. So they were going to negotiate with a 14-year-old boy. Now, he amazingly agreed to abolish the poll tax and grant free pardons, meaning I will exact no punishment, no revenge for your actions if you go home immediately. On that night, though, peasants broke into the Tower of London. They captured powerful lords Sudbury and Hales and cut off their heads. And Sudbury's decapitation supposedly took 8 hacks, 8 blows with the sword in order to separate his head. So all of a sudden, it had gone from an organization with a mob of people, 60,000, that were indeed causing property damage, but not necessarily murdering those in charge, when some of the most powerful lords in London were captured and killed by this mob. So the king decides to meet them again, this time outside of the city walls. So he gets the mob outside of London, the city of London, and he meets them at a place called Smithfield. Now, this is what happens. Wat Tyler is killed under mysterious circumstances. Now, when I say mysterious circumstances, some say that he attacked or insulted the king or the mayor of London. Some say that he was incredibly rude and was trying to start a fight, whereas some say the king's men attacked him first. In any event, there was a fight and Wat Tyler was killed. And the king decides to go back on his word because of this supposed attempt on his life, where Wat Tyler had attacked and the peasants had attacked him, even though he was there to meet with them and there to try and solve their problems. They attacked and he was forced to meet violence with violence to defend himself. Now, this is a bit of a problem. So we don't actually know exactly what happened here. Most of the information that is recorded, that is written down about the Peasants' Revolt, was written down by people called chroniclers in things called chronicles, sort of like reporting or meeting notes, if you will, for the events throughout history. But they were written by monks who did not actually see what happened. They weren't there themselves. They wrote down what they heard from other people. Now, the issue with writing things down from other people means you only get their side of the story. You're not entirely sure what's true. And of course, if someone tells me a story and they tell me 8 things and I only agree with 7 of them, I might only write the 7 down. So this is another reason that the mystery of Wat Tyler's death and the circumstances of it all is not entirely clear. There basically are 2 sides of the story. Either the peasants were betrayed by this murderous king, this terrible king, this 14-year-old tyrant, or the brave king was able to defeat these violent rebels. It all depends whose story you believe. Now then, I'm not going to tell you necessarily which one you should believe. Let's just look at what happened after the Peasants' Revolt. So we know that King Richard did not keep his promises. Serfdom, also known as the feudal system, if you will, where peasants are not exactly what you would call free. They don't have the option of going and working for whoever they want. They don't have the option of traveling wherever they want. They're forced to pay whatever they're told to pay. All of these particular restrictions on their freedom, which King Richard had said he was going to get rid of, he did not. In fact, royal armies went up and down England and put down the revolts. They killed the rebels, they killed the leaders, and they ensured that the people knew who was in charge. Hundreds of rebels were hanged, so this was done in public, keeping in mind that the reason you would kill people in public and make it a large grand gesture and ceremony of it is you want people to see it, you want people to talk about it, you want people to spread the message for you. So if you hang 10 rebel leaders, that should scare the other 1,000 rebels that might have followed those leaders into getting back to work. But the rebellion did indeed frighten the rich. They were quite scared because they realized that if they keep asking and asking and asking for taxes and taxes and taxes, eventually you're asking too much and the peasants might fight back. Now they saw the peasants burning particular buildings, murdering or beheading lords that they thought that the peasants deemed were guilty of betraying the people, and this made the wealthy quite frightened. They did not want these people to rebel. So no king ever collected a poll tax again. So from that standpoint, I suppose you could say the Peasants' Revolt achieved one of its goals. Now, long term, over the next 50 years, demands of peasants were actually largely met. Most of the time, when peasants started to make some of these demands, they didn't have to go on these long marches to London. They were met, even if they were somewhat negotiated and only met on the king's conditions. But that did mean that the average life for the average peasant technically did improve over that time. They were allowed to take jobs of their choice. They were allowed to go and work for different lords who either treated them kindly or gave them better work hours, gave them better wages, and they were even allowed to make the amazing choice of choosing who to marry. Wow, what a huge freedom that is. So technically speaking, things did get better for the peasants, and eventually serfdom and the feudal system sort of started dying out in England at the time. Now, this particular process of the ending of the feudal system wouldn't happen in France until they had their own revolt or their own rebellion, their own revolution, if you will, in the 1790s, meaning they were well behind in terms of development and advancement of society, and especially in terms of having more skilled or more productive workers in their economy. And certainly this was seen again in Russia, where serfdom was not formally eradicated until the 1860s, and of course wouldn't be practically eradicated until the early 1900s. One of the reasons that the Russian society was so far behind in the Industrial Revolution, and this played out in World War I, for example. So we can see this was this Peasants' Revolt and the advancing of rights and granting of freedoms to the people actually helps the nation. There has been no nation ever that has given rights to its citizens and had that nation become worse. That's not a thing. The expansion of rights has always been good. No one has ever said, oh, I can't believe we gave those people the right to vote, or I can't believe we gave those people equality. I can't believe we gave those people a particular freedom or particular choice in their own lives. Everything's gotten worse since we allowed people to be free. That's not a thing. Okay, so with all of that said, I hope you have learned something for today. I hope you can see how these particularly violent protests that the king thought he had to put down and had to absolutely crush and kill all the leaders and dominate the streets, if you will. I hope we can see how that was the wrong approach and how, in fact, granting them and responding to their wishes, which was done subsequently after the Peasants' Revolt, actually made the nation better. So, I hope I wasn't too subtle on that one. So I hope we can see why the Peasants' Revolt should be remembered, why the Peasants' Revolt was important, and how the history of violent protest goes back a long, long, long way. And most of the time, violent protest is in response to a tyrannical government, if you will, people asking too much of the peasants, people asking too much of the average workers, people asking too much of the people. So, with all of that said, I hope you have a good day, and I'll see you next time.